Good morning, everybody. I am John Michael G. Buenaobra from Batangas, and I will be reporting on World Roots of Education. Primarily, we have the education in pre-literate societies. Our narrative begins in pre-literate times, before the invention of reading and writing, when our ancestors transmitted their culture from one generation to another. We can find the origins of informal learning in our own families and appreciate why it remains so powerful even today. Although we live in a time when information is stored electronically, an examination of pre-literate education can help us understand why schools often tend to resist change as they train the young in essential survival skills. Pre-literate people face the almost overwhelming problems of surviving in an environment in which they have to fight against floods, wild animals, and attacks from hostile groups. By trial and error, they developed survival skills that over time became cultural patterns. Over time, groups develop survival skills and pass this on to their young. They mark the passage from childhood to adulthood with ritual dancing, music, and dramatic acting to create a powerful supernatural meaning and evoke a moral response. Thus, children learn the group's prescriptions or the acceptable behaviors, as well as its prescriptions or taboos, which are known as the forbidden behaviors. Lacking writing to record their past, pre-literate societies relied on oral tradition, and that is storytelling, to transmit their cultural heritage. Elders or priests, often gifted storytellers, sang or recited narratives of the group's past. Combining myths and actual historical events, the oral tradition developed group identity by telling young people about the group's heroes, victories, and defeats. The songs and stories help the young learn the group's spoken language and its values. Stories and storytelling remain an important and engaging educational strategy, especially in preschools and primary grades, even today. Through stories, children meet their culture and its heroes, legends, and past. So, talking about literacy. As language users, we created and manipulated symbols. Beginning to express these symbols in signs, pictographs, and letters, and creating a written language constituted our great cultural leap to literacy and then to schooling. Once writing was invented, children needed to be taught to read and write. Education in Chinese civilization. Chinese civilization's long history and vast influence offer significant insights into education's evolution. With the world's largest population, modern China is an important global power. Historically, it was a great empire whose civilization reached high pinnacles of political, social, and educational development. At this juncture, let's have the Confucian education. To examine the origins of Chinese education, we have to go back to the 3rd century when China was beset by political and cultural upheaval. During such periods of social turmoil, educational controversies focus on either preserving or changing the culture. Three competing philosophies, so we have the legalism, Taoism, and Confucianism, propose different paths for education. Legalism advocated a highly disciplined authoritarian government that would uphold order at all costs. The legalist aim in education was to indoctrinate people to accept law and order as they defined it. Taoism, associated with Lao Tzu, presented a philosophical alternative to legalism that still influences Chinese culture and education. Unlike the legalists who sought to control others, Lao Tzu advised people to stop trying to control other people and events, go with the stream of life, and live simply and spontaneously. Confucianism replaced legalism as China's official philosophy. Confucius, on the other hand, did not deal with theological or metaphysical issues about human beings' relationship to God or the universe. He believed it was much more important to establish the conditions for an ethical society than to seek to answer unanswerable questions. He also created an educational system based on an ethical hierarchy of responsibilities that began with the emperor and flowed downward, touching everyone in society. Everyone in the hierarchy should clearly know her or his status, duties, and responsibilities and the proper way of behaving toward others. As part of his ethical system of education, Confucius emphasized civility, polite, correct, and proper behavior. He also believed that people learn to behave ethically when they have a clear model of behavior before them that they can imitate. The concept of hierarchy has important implications for education, especially character formation. Confucianist ethics set up definite patterns of behavior rather than flexible ones. People are accorded various levels of respect based on their position, status, and achievements. Character education means to learn one's roles in the network of relationships that form the community and to fulfill the prescribed role behaviors that will ensure social harmony. When we are dealing with respect for teachers in China, teacher-student relationships were well known and followed with precision. Students were to hold their teachers in high regard and respect. Confucius' own students referred to him as the master. So, all important educational legacy from ancient China was its system of national examinations. Thus, importance of examinations was the China's contribution to world and Western education. Education in ancient Greek and Roman civilizations. The educational history of ancient Greece and Rome illuminates the origins of culture and education. The Greeks and Romans sought to answer such persistent educational questions as what is true, good, and beautiful, what models should education use in preparing good citizens, and how should education respond to social, economic, and political change. Let's talk about the Homeric education. Like ritual ceremonies in pre-literate societies, Homer's dramatic portrayal of the Greek warriors' battles against the Trojans served important educational purposes. First, it preserved the culture by transmitting it from adults to the young. Second, it cultivated Greek cultural identity based on mythic and historical origins. And third, it shaped the character of the young. When we talk about the citizenship education, the ancient Greece also illuminates education's role in forming good citizens. Then we have the enculturation and formal education. When we talk about enculturation, it is the process by which an individual learns the traditional content of a culture and assimilates its practices and values. So the Greeks understood the importance of enculturation with formal education. Through enculturation, Greek youths were prepared to become citizens of their society. Formal education, in turn, provided the knowledge needed to fulfill more completely the expectations of the society of its citizens. The economies of the Greek city heavily relied on slave labor. The majority of slaves, including women and children, were prisoners of war or those judicially condemned to servitude. Most slaves performed agricultural or commercial work because the Athenians believed that slaves did not need the education appropriate for freemen. In male dominated Greek society, only a minority of exceptional women received any formal education. In Athens, where women had severely limited legal and economic rights, only few attended schools, and more fortunate, young women were taught at home by tutors. Then we have the sophists. So when we talk about the sophists, it is a group of educators. The sophists sought to develop their students' communication skills so they could become successful advocates and legislators. The sophists' most important subjects were grammar, logic, and rhetoric, subjects that later developed into the liberal arts. Logic, the rules of correct argument, trained students to organize their presentations clearly, and grammar developed their powers of using language effectively. The rhetoric, it is a study of persuasive speech, was especially important for future orators. The sophists claimed that they could educate their students to win public debates by teaching them how to use crowd psychology to know what would appeal to an audience, how to organize a persuasive and convincing argument, and skill in public speaking. And that is knowing what words, examples, and lines of reasoning to use to win the debate or the case. So we have the Protagoras method. Protagoras, a prominent sophist, devised a highly effective five-step teaching strategy. He delivered an outstanding speech so that students knew their teacher could actually do what he taught. This speech also gave them a model to imitate. Then Protagoras had the students examine the great speeches of famous orators to enlarge their repertoire of possible models. Study the key subjects of logic, grammar, and rhetoric, and deliver practice orations which he assessed to provide feedback to students. And finally, the student orators delivered public speeches. We also have Socrates and his education by self-examination. Socrates believed that knowledge was based on what was true universally, at all places, at all times. Socrates is important in educational history because he firmly defended the academic freedom to think, question, and teach. He was also significant as the teacher of Plato, who later systematized many of Socrates' ideas. Moral excellence was far superior to the sophist technical training. Socrates did not believe that knowledge or wisdom could be transmitted from a teacher to a student because he believed the concepts of true knowledge were present but buried within the person's mind. A liberal education would stimulate learners to discover ideas by bringing to consciousness the truth that was latent. So when we say latent, that's present but not visible in their minds. Socrates encouraged students to use critical self-examination to find and bring to consciousness the universal truth that was present in each person's mind. As a teacher, Socrates asked leading questions that stimulated students to think deeply about the meaning of life, truth, and justice. In answering these questions, students engaged in a rigorous discussion or dialogue in which they clarified, criticized, and deconstructed their basic concepts. And that's what we call the Socratic method, which is challenging for both teachers and students. So we have Plato and his eternal truths and values. Socrates' pupil, Plato, followed his mentor's educational path. Plato argued that reality existed in an unchanging world of perfect ideas, universal concepts such as truth, goodness, justice, and beauty. Plato's theory of knowledge is called reminiscence, a process by which individuals recall the ideas present but latent in their minds. Reminiscence implies that the human soul before birth has lived in a spiritual world of ideas, the source of all truth and knowledge. Those who subscribe to universal truth and values assert that genuine knowledge is intellectual, changeless, and eternal, not relative and sensory. Because what is always true is true. Education should also be universal and unchanging. The Republic. In Plato's Republic, the philosopher projected a plan for a perfect society ruled by philosopher kings, an intellectual elite. Although Plato's utopian state was never implemented, his ideas are useful in portraying an idealized version of a certain kind of education. The Republic divided inhabitants into three classes: the philosopher, the auxiliaries or the military defenders, and the workers who produced goods and provided services. Similar to those who argue today that test results ought to determine the kind of education that a person should receive, the educators in Plato's Republic sorted people in groups based on their perceived intellectual ability and educated or trained them accordingly. Once assigned to a class, individuals in the Republic would receive the education appropriate to their social role. The philosopher kings were responsible for identifying the intellectually able in the next generation and preparing them for their destined roles. The second class, the warriors, would be trained to defend the Republic and to take orders from the philosopher kings. The third and the largest class, the workers, would be trained as farmers and artisans. Plato believed that women possessed the same intellectual ability as men and should have the same educational privileges and civic responsibilities accorded men. So when we are talking about the state-run nurseries, actually fearing that parents would pass on their ignorance to their children. Plato wanted children reared by experts in child care. Children separated from their parents would live in state nurseries where the environment was controlled so that they acquired what Plato regarded as positive moral values. From ages 6 to 18, so we are talking about the Plato's basic curriculum. From ages 6 to 18, children and adolescents attended schools to study music and gymnastics. Music was broadly defined to include reading, writing, literature, arithmetic, choral singing, and dancing. After mastering reading and writing, students would read the approved classics. Plato, who believed in censorship, wanted an officially approved literature. Regarding literature as a powerful force in character formation, Plato believed young people should read only officially selected poems and stories that showed truthfulness, obedience to authorities, courage, and control of emotions. After mastering basic arithmetic, students learned geometry and astronomy, which cultivated higher level abstract thinking. Gymnastics, useful for military training, included fencing, archery, javelin throwing, and horseback riding, which developed physical coordination. So in higher education, from ages 18 to 20, students pursued intensive physical and military training. At 20, the future philosopher kings would be selected for 10 years of additional higher education in the more abstract and theoretical subjects of mathematics, geometry, astronomy, music, and science. At age 30, the less intellectually able among this group would become civil servants. The most intellectually capable would continue the higher philosophical study of metaphysics, searching for the principles that explained ultimate reality. When their studies were completed, the philosopher kings would rule the republic. At age 50, the philosopher kings would become the republic's elder statesmen. Aristotle, cultivation of rationality. Unlike his mentor Plato, Aristotle held that reality exists objectively, so he established realism. Aristotle noted that objects exist outside of our minds, but believed that by sensation and abstraction we can acquire knowledge about them. For Aristotle, knowing begins with one sensation of objects in the environment. From the sensory experience, one forms concepts about the objects. Aristotle also argues that the good community rests on its members' rationality, that the purpose of education is to cultivate liberally educated, rational people who can use their reason to govern their society. He also saw vocational training as limited to learning specific skills. Aristotle's curriculum. Aristotle recommended compulsory schooling, in which infant schooling was to consist of play, physical activity, and appropriate stories. Children from ages 7 to 14 learned basic numeracy and literacy and proper moral habits to prepare them for future study in liberal arts. Their curriculum also included physical education and music to cultivate proper emotional dispositions. From age 15 through 21, youths would study mathematics, geometry, astronomy, grammar, literature, poetry, rhetoric, ethics, and politics. At age 21, students would proceed to more theoretical subjects such as physics, cosmology, biology, psychology, logic, and metaphysics. Aristotle, like Plato, also endorsed the idea that education was intended to prepare a person for higher studies. So, believing women were intellectually inferior to men, Aristotle was concerned only with male education. So, girls were to be trained to perform the household chores and duties needed for their future roles as wives and mothers. Next, we have the education in ancient Rome. As in ancient Greece, only a minority of Romans was formally educated. Schools were private and attended only by males who could pay tuition. Whereas, upper class girls often learned to read and write at home or were taught by tutors. Boys from these families attended a primary school and then secondary schools taught by Latin and Greek grammar teachers. Rome's educational ideal was exemplified in the orator. The ideal Roman orator was the broadly and liberally educated man of public life. So we have the senator, lawyer, teacher, civil servant, and politician. To examine the Roman ideal of oratory, we turn to Quintilian. Marcus Fabius Quintilianus, or Quintilian, was one of the Rome's most highly recognized rhetoricians. Quintilian emphasized the need to base instruction on the learner's readiness and stage of development. Anticipating the modern teacher's service preparation, he recognized the importance of students' individual differences, advised that instruction be appropriate to their readiness and abilities, and urged that teachers motivate students by making lessons interesting and engaging. Quintilian developed an early version of stage-based learning that corresponded to the patterns of human development. He recognized the importance of early childhood in shaping the patterns of adult behavior. For the first stage, from birth until age 7, when children impulsively sought to satisfy their immediate needs and desires, he advised parents to select well-trained and well-spoken nurses and companions for their children. In Quintilian's second stage of education, from 7 to 14, the boy should learn from sense experiences, form clear ideas, and train his memory. He now learned to write the languages that he already spoke. The primary teacher, who taught reading and writing in the primary school, must possess worthy character and teaching competence. Instruction in reading and writing should be slow and thorough, with children learning the alphabet by tracing them from a set of letters. Okay, so moving on, we have the Islam, Arabic learning, and education. Islamic civilization, originating with the Arabs, became a global cultural and educational force through its ability to absorb, reinterpret, and transmit knowledge from one world region to another. The origins of Islamic culture began with Muhammad, an Arab religious reformer who is revered by his followers as the last and most important of God's prophets. He also preached the need for faith, prayer, repentance, and living an upright moral life. He also organized his ideas into Islam, a new religion with a sacred book, the Quran, or the Quran. Written in, written in Arabic, the Quran, Islam's most sacred book, prescribes the pillars of faith and religious observance. Prayers are to be said 5 times each day at dawn, noon, mid afternoon, sunset, and nightfall. Then we have the medieval culture and education. The medieval period was characterized first by a decline in learning and then by its revival by scholastic educators. As in earlier Greek and Roman eras, class and gender limited schooling to only a small minority. The majority of students were men studying for religious careers as priests or monks. Women's education in medieval society varied according to their socio-economic class. Although medieval Christianity stressed women's spiritual equality and the sacramental nature of marriage, women continued to be consigned to traditional gender-prescribed roles. Girls of low classes learned household chores and duties by imitating their mothers. Women of the noble classes also followed the prescriptions of their class and learned the roles appropriate to the code of chivalry, which often meant managing the domestic life of castle. Despite these limited possibilities for women's education, medieval schools and universities were reserved for men, guaranteeing male dominance of society. Aquinas, scholastic education. So let's deal first with faith and reason combined. Actually, by the 11th century, medieval educators had developed scholasticism. That is a method of theological and philosophical scholarship and teaching. These scholastics adhered to the scriptures and doctrines of the Christian faith and human reasoning, especially Aristotle's philosophy, as complementary sources of truth. These scholastics believed that the Bible and the teachings of the church were revealed supernatural truths. Scholastic teachers were clerics and schools were governed and protected by the church. The curriculum was organized into formal subjects. For example, in higher education, the subject disciplines were logic, mathematics, natural and moral philosophy, metaphysics, and theology. In their teaching, scholastics used the syllogism or the deductive reasoning to create organized bodies of knowledge. They also emphasize basic principles and their implications. In addition to formal schooling, Aquinas recognized the importance of informal education through family, friends, and environment. And it is believed that preserving and institutionalizing knowledge is the medieval contribution to Western education. Moving forward, we have the Renaissance classical humanism. The Renaissance, a transitional period between the medieval and modern ages, began in the 14th and reached its zenith in the 15th century. It was characterized by a revived emphasis on the humanistic aspects of the Greek and Latin classics. Like the medieval scholastics, Renaissance educators called classical humanists looked to the past rather than the future. The Renaissance humanist educators were literary figures. We have the writers, poets, translators, and critics. Artist teachers, critics of society and taste, they usually brought wit and charm to their work. They sought to educate critically minded people who could challenge existing customs and expose and correct mediocrity in literature and life. The Renaissance did not dramatically expand school attendance. Humanist preparatory and secondary schools educated children of the nobility and upper classes. Elementary schools served the commercial middle classes, while the lower socioeconomic class children received little, if any, of the formal schooling. Erasmus, critic and humanist. Desiderius Erasmus is the leading classical humanist scholar of the Renaissance. He believed that a teacher's worldview and academic preparation were highly important for successful teaching as a humanist educator. Teachers needed to have an ecumenical and global outlook that was not limited by narrow interest. As part of their pre-service preparation, teachers needed to be well educated in the liberal arts, especially in the classical Greek and Latin languages and literature, and in history and religion. As a humanist, Erasmus was most concerned with the teaching of literature. He suggested motivating students to read good books by having them explore an author's meaning in their own lives. He also encouraged teachers to use conversations, games, and activities to illustrate a book's meaning. Erasmus also advised that we should gain the love of our subjects and to study the arts of peace, especially diplomacy, and avoid war. So, emphasis on classical languages and literature, humanistic knowledge or human centered knowledge, and the printing press. These are the Renaissance contributions to Western education. In addition, we have the religious reformation and education. The Protestant religious reformation of the 16th and 17th centuries was stimulated by significant social, economic, and political changes in Europe. The emergence of centralized national states shifted people's loyalty to their own monarchs and away from the Pope. Protestant religious reformers, for example, we have John Calvin and Martin Luther, they sought to free themselves and their followers from papal authority and to interpret their own religious doctrines and practices. Reformation leaders concerned themselves with questions of knowledge, education, and schooling because they wanted these powerful weapons to advance the Protestant cause. Then, to ensure doctrinal conformity, religious educators developed the catechistic method of instruction. In question and answer form, catechisms summarize the particular denomination's doctrines and practices. Although memorization had always been a feature of schooling, the catechistic method reinforced it. The belief was that if children memorized the catechism, they would internalize the doctrines of their church. We have Martin Luther, Protestant reformer. So he stands out as one of the most important religious reformers in shaping Western history and education. Luther recognized education as a potent ally of religious reformation. He saw church, state, family, and school as crucial reform agencies, believing that the family had a key role in forming children's character and behavior. Luther encouraged family Bible reading and prayer. He also wanted parents to make sure that children had vocational training so they would support themselves as adults and become productive citizens. He also advised sorry, he also advised public officials to take educational responsibility and emphasize schooling's political, economic, and spiritual benefits. Schools should be organized and inspected by state officials to make sure that teachers were educating children in correct religious doctrines and training them to become literate, orderly, and productive citizens. Luther's views on women's education reflected traditional restrictions but also contained liberating ideas. Influenced by St. Paul, he believed that the husband, as the head of the household, had authority over his wife. Domestic duties remained women's appropriate roles. On the other hand, Luther's emphasis on reading the Bible in one's own language meant that girls as well as boys were to attend primary schools. Schooling thus gave women a shared, if subordinate, role in educating their own children. Then finally, we have the Enlightenment's influence on education. Unlike the medieval scholastics and Renaissance humanists who based their ideas about education on the past, the Enlightenment philosophers, scientists, and educators examined the present and looked forward to the future. Rather than relying on tradition, Enlightenment educators also emphasize using reason and the scientific method to improve the present situation and create a better future. They used the scientific method of empirical observation to discover how nature and how the universe worked. In education, they observed children, especially their stages of development, play, and activities to construct a natural method of instruction. That ends my report. Thank you very much.